Hello, I'm John Greenlee. Welcome to the new garden. You know, gardening in the shade can be maddening. You plant something you think is going to grow, but it just doesn't work. And most of us have a shady spot somewhere in the garden. So today we're in Pasadena, California to talk to Chris Rossmini. Chris is a gardener and garden designer who has lots of experience in gardening in the shade. Let's go talk to Chris and see what we can learn. Hello, Chris.
Hi, John.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Just where I thought I'd find you, in the nursery, shopping. Are you smitten by all this color?
Well, I'm always admiring of it, but actually what appeals to me for brightening up a dark corner in a shady spot is the variegated things, the new variegated ivies that have come out recently, and the hydrangeas and various things where the foliage color is what gives you the brightness. It lightens up a dark area, and it lasts all year, rather than just a couple of months.
You know, Chris, I know a lot of people are really frustrated trying to garden in the shade. Is shade a handicap?
Well, it's a constraint, but it's certainly something that you can work with and maybe come out with a better solution than if you just had a completely sunny place and could grow anything you wanted. The variegated things, I mean, these all year just provide a pool of yellow in a dark spot. You can get a silvery effect with these little ground covers that just make a sheet of silvery gray-green. And then you've got things like the variegated hydrangeas where you have the flowers and you have the foliage the rest of the year. The first thing you have to do if you're talking about gardening in the shade is get rid of the idea that you're going to try and nurse grass along there, as turf grass at least. That's probably the archetypical plant that evolved for sunny conditions. But there are a lot of other things that will either grow partially in the shade or shade part of the day or shade almost all of the time that were developed in nature for those conditions.
There's different degrees of shade, isn't there?
Oh, sure. There's, you know, shade next to buildings. There's shade under deciduous trees. There's shade under evergreen trees that is filtered light but is constant all year. There's morning sun and afternoon sun and shade the rest of the time. There's also in the progression through the year, there's shade under deciduous trees in the summertime where plants are getting sun in the winter. So there's a tremendous variety of conditions you're dealing with there.
I'd love to see some examples of gardening in the shade. Can you show us some gardens that you've done?
Certainly.
Great.
I can take you to one of my clients' gardens.
Well, let's go do that.
Okay.
What are we looking at here?
Well, actually, John, this is a garden that we built in the center of an established garden, and it was intended to cope with several kinds of shade and sun exposures. If this is a house with a lovely shady overhang of a porch, which makes a great place to sit, but the overhang made it impossible to admire the plants in the garden as you sat on the porch. So we raised up the beds here in front with this dry wall and backfilled it with really nice soil to get rid of the tree roots and make it a good place to grow things. And then gradually, as we planted things, we planted sunny things in the front where they get the morning sun, and then shade tolerant and then very shade tolerant things as we moved into the back. So you can see along the back the variegated foliage from the old variegated Algerian ivy and the ficus, and some of the other things in the back are the things providing the brilliance back there, and then we can actually have some flowers here in the front. Some of these things are shade-tolerant things. Some of them are things that are suffering a little from being in the shade, but they do get the morning sun, so they're in pretty good shape. These are plants that are mostly adapted to growing in shade. They'd probably burn if you put them out in full sun. So, and here, you know, out in the lawn, we did keep the lawn here, but notice it's in the sunniest part of the entire garden, so that we aren't infringing on it at any point. It can look good, and then the other plants can do well in the shade. The topiaries are things that want sun, and then we did the little steps so we could have a sort of rock garden effect out of it. This is the little geranium macrorhizum, and it's a plant that's adapted to sun or shade pretty well. You can grow it, I'm not in blasting full sun, but certainly in sunnier spots than this. And it'll probably flower not quite as well, but look good in even shadier bits. And then as you get further away, the greener geraniums are perhaps more adapted to shade, and then beyond it, you've got the little campanulas, and this little purple-violet labradorica is awfully pretty. Yeah. This is a plant I really like. It's a little corydalus, again, Corydalus lutea, with small yellow flowers. It's like a little grayish fern almost.
Chris, I noticed
Yeah.
some succulents. You know, I normally don't think of succulents being used in the shade.
Well, again, this gets morning sun, so it's not a totally shaded position. And some things will actually adapt pretty well to it.
What are some of the things that we notice when we're in a plant, when we're pushing it into an environment where it's maybe getting more shade than it really wants?
Well, you'll notice that things get leggy sometimes. It's what we generally call it. It means that they stretch out, the spaces between the leaves get longer, and you'll find them leaning all in one direction, facing toward the sun. You'll almost always see that where you plant things up against a house if it's a really shady position, because things will turn to face the light. The flowers and the leaves will present themselves so they get the most sunlight possible. This makes it sometimes very hard to plant things where you've got a window, because all you'll see is sort of the undersides of everything. It won't be as attractive as it would be otherwise. But, and you can also see that things will grow leaning, which makes a rather nice presentation from the front, like this hydrangea. It's tending to face out toward the street, but that's actually better than if it faced back toward the house.
Chris, in addition to variegated foliage, I noticed you in the shade here, you're using a lot of plants that have either golden foliage or golden or yellow flowers.
Well, that also is a way of lightening things up. The yellow color carries further, and very often things that grow in the shade have lighter colored flowers. They'll have white or pale yellow flowers, or often pale blue ones. So that this also is a lightening effect in the shade. They show up better in the shade too, which is nice. Deep purple flowers wouldn't do much for you in a dark corner. So.
There's a little yellow flower on the corylus you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, that again is that very ferny little plant. And it seeds around modestly. It's not a pest, but it's one of those little annuals that you'll never lose once it's gotten started.
These are forget-me-nots in the back?
Mm-hmm. And there's the datura that we were talking about earlier, the big yellow flowers.
I recognize that plant back there. That's the aspidistra, the cast iron plant.
Oh, yeah, that's a plant for the really darkest corner you've got. You grow that with the clivias and things, and they'll grow in closets. They're so adaptable to dark spaces.
Tell us more about some of these plants coming through here.
Okay, well, you can see, again, the variegated ivies there in a little topiary. There are some geraniums. This is Geranium Claridge Druce, which it's a woodland plant, so it really grows well in conditions under trees. The larger leaves are Japanese anemones, these guys, and these bloom in the fall. They have tall stalks with what look like single white or pink daisies on them. And there's a lot of things in here, including some azaleas and things that you think of as standard woodland ground cover plants. Some of the ground covers here in the front are ajuga and a little ranunculus, a little geranium that's a plant that seeds around maybe a little too generously. And again, more of the Japanese anemones, and an illustration of the fact that very often where you have these big lush leaves in shady places, this is snail country as well.
Well, I see this keeps the snails out of the garden.
Right, if they can read.
I noticed these ornamental grasses here. This is the northern sea oats, Chasmathium latifolium.
Yes, which we planted in one little clump in the back and has spread through this. But one of the things I love to see, particularly when you're trying to do a woodland or a meadowy effect, is seeing these plants come up through other plants and just sort of let them mingle together so that it's a much more naturalistic look than it would be if you had a clump of something neatly shaped here and another clump of something neatly shaped there. I think this blending, like it was in the lower areas over there with the flatter ground cover plants, is kind of one of the romantic aspects of gardening that is very appealing to me, and I think to a few other people as well.
And again, that's how you'd see it probably growing in nature, wouldn't you?
Oh, certainly. You wouldn't see these things in nice, neat little beds with labels in front of them.
Chris, does growing this rose on a trellis here help it to get up and into the sunlight?
Oh, well, growing the roses and the other vines on these posts allows us to grow things at different levels in the garden, so that you can have the roses blooming up there, and you can have the labateras you see here in the middle ground, and then the ground plane things as well. So this gives you a lot more opportunity for getting color into the garden and a longer sequence of flowering. This is a
scented geranium.
This is the peppermint scented pelargonium, Pelargonium tomentosum, which smells like chocolate peppermint creams and has wonderful velvety foliage, grows nicely in shade. And then there's a little yellow leaf plant in there, a helichrysum, that also likes a shady spot. These now are things that really want sunnier places, the roses, the achilleas, but this is a sunny spot in the garden. It's not overhung by the trees and it gets full afternoon sun. But you can see as you go further back into the bed, the things have to accommodate themselves to a lot more shade because these small trees that were, of course, even smaller when we put them in are beginning to make a fairly dominant statement now and really influencing the climate underneath them. Actually, we've got some even better examples of how to deal with shade in the back garden here.
Well, let's go see.
Okay. You know, we've been talking about shade all along as though it were always a handicap, but in a climate like ours, it's an absolute necessity for the people, if not the plants. And this is a place where we made shade for that purpose. Shade to sit in here. The arbor replaced a tree that was here, and when it died, it was obviously so important to the entire garden that something had to be done to replace the function of it and make a shady place. And it also made a place to grow plants that couldn't have been grown otherwise. The trees were planted here to give shade to the space and to enclose it and give a feeling of privacy. And we planted deciduous trees almost exclusively so that you would have the space underneath them in the winter and the early spring to grow bulbs and things that require full sun, and you'd have color from those. They're all spring flowering things. And then the perennial border plants take over later. And the trees are kept pruned out and thinned regularly so that things will grow under them. And, you know, over the years, it's a matter of choosing things that will take a little more shade all the time.
Chris, I really enjoy what you've done here with this ivy collection.
Well, these are the variegated ivies we were looking at the nursery, many of them. And you can see how much they do lighten up a dark space. This is one of the very dark parts of this garden, under the overhang, next to the wall, under the arbor, but see what a feeling of liveliness it gives to the background here.
And what a versatile plant. You're using it not only as a hanging basket and a potted plant, but a ground cover.
It is, and here it's even grown up into a topiary.
Look at this, an ivy topiary.
Yes, making an umbrella, another source of shade for the garden.
How did you do this?
Actually, I think it's an old beach umbrella.
Well, what a clever idea for an old umbrella. Well, show us a little bit of the border.
Okay. As I said, the border is planted under trees, and it's pretty standard perennial plants, choosing the things that were most shade tolerant in the shadier spots. Here's Francoa ramosa. It's not quite out yet, but it has these long wands of flowers of white and pale pink.
Boy, it's one of my favorite plants for the shade.
I actually think it's a gorgeous thing. We've got green calla lily back here. This is the variegated one with the green flush to the end. Things that flower at different times of the year. Again, the trees get thinned out sometimes so that there's more sun in here, but all of these things seem to be adapting and blooming quite nicely.
What's this here?
This is Cleome, an annual. Grown, it has pink or white or rose-colored flowers. It's a wonderfully exotic blossom, looks almost like an orchid, and it has vicious thorns. This is a pink tababuia. It has big pink trumpet flowers early in the spring, in January or February here, so that you have a mass of pink blossom and bulbs underneath it, and now things are coming up underneath. You've got the roses, which are just finished. Now the alströmerias are taking over, so there's a sequence of things happening here always. This is Verbena bornariense. It's one of my favorite things. It'll grow in quite a bit of shade and still flower, and it has this wonderful airy look, and I love the way they catch the light like that.
Just little poofs of blue color up in the
It's
up
like,
above.
They're almost like they're tethered there on strings, like balloons, rather than flowers growing up out of the ground. And then here, of course, you've got more sun because of less trees.
Here's more of the Japanese anemone that we saw earlier. Guess if something works, go with it.
Absolutely. And another thing you'll see repeated a lot in this garden are the abutilons. Here you've got Abutilon megapotamicum, one of the small flowered ones with the sort of red round calyxes and the yellow flowers coming out of it. And you can see over on that wall later a clear pale yellow one that's almost a tree. And then this whole border, which is a shady one, has azaleas, camellias, things that really always look good in the shade and provide a nice shrubby background to all of these perennials, so that there's still a structure here even when the perennials have disappeared. Sometimes in a mixed shade and sun situation, you don't even have to hope for flowers. Here's a plant, Dianella tasmanica, with these luscious, big indigo blue berries that flowers are almost insignificant, but the berries are really quite spectacular. And they look so good with that yellow abutilon behind it.
Chris, those berries are just stunning.
They are. It's a plant that grows in sun or shade, actually, and it's spreads around a little by stolons, but it's nice to give a lush, moist effect around a little pond like this. And it picks up the blue of the water hyacinths that happen later on, a water plant that actually will grow and flower in a bit of shade as well.
So there's plenty of showy fruits for the shade also.
Oh, yes.
Chris, I'm really admiring the pond that you have here in this shady situation.
Oh, well, water is just a natural thing to go with a shady spot. You like the feeling of freshness and greenery and lushness and coolness, and what gives you more of that effect than water? You can have water that just bubbles slightly here. You can have waterfalls. You can have all sorts of things. I like quiet water myself. I like just to know that it's there. Think of it as refreshing.
Chris, what are some of the considerations, though, when you have a pond in the shade that differ from having a pond in a sunny situation?
Well, you can't grow water lilies is one of the main things, but it's a lot easier to keep the algae out, so it's kind of a give-and-take situation. Most of the flowering water plants require more sun, or at least half-day sun. In a situation like this, where it gets probably, 5 or 6 hours of sun out of the day, there are things that you can grow that'll flower in it. Some of the smaller water lilies, the water hyacinths, some of the water iris can be spectacular in the pond, and they don't take full sun, absolutely.
Do you ever just experiment? Do you know when you plant a plant that every one of these plants is going to work?
Oh, no, of course not. Gardening is nothing but experiments, one after another, and I may have a vague idea that it work, or I may wish it would work, but I've had to go back and redo things occasionally. But every once in a while when you try something, you get a wonderful surprise. Things that you thought might possibly marginally look good turn out to be tremendous.
Is part of the idea of mixing things up that you get something so that essentially when one thing stops, another thing starts, and the color goes over a longer period of time over the year?
That's certainly one of the factors that makes me inclined to do it. The other is I think it's just more interesting. That I think part of the magic of gardening comes out of these interplays of textures and colors and the subtle changes between one foliage and another, and then you inject the flowers sometimes, and it's you get a constant change. It's almost like a tapestry that changes month to month. But.
Well, Chris, I think this is a tremendously successful garden for a shady garden. You know, I understand you have quite a garden of your own. Can we go see that?
Certainly. And that's a definitely shady one.
All right. Well, let's go see it. Chris, this is your own garden. Tell us what you had to work with here.
Well, this is where I really learned about gardening in the shade, because we fell in love with a house with big trees and a beautiful view. And when I sat down and thought about gardening, I realized we had big trees at the top of a north-facing slope, and I had absolutely no sunlight to garden in half of the year and very little the rest of the year. So I moved things around, and I built raised beds. This border in the front, you can see from the nasturtiums, gets a little bit of sun. This side is sunny, but at the back of this border, about midway, it becomes shade all year. So I had to resort to things that would live in the shade. And I wound up again with Japanese anemones, with a lot of things with dramatic foliage. A plant I'm particularly fond of is this sort of purpley leafed one with the little purple ageratum type flowers.
I can see it.
That's Eupatorium sordidum, and the foliage looks wonderful all year, and then the flowers early in the year are a bonus. There's Ruellium acrantha, which has big rose pink blooms, but most of the time it just has nice mid-green leaves. Again, there's that chartreuse form of the Justicia. And then behind it, there's several kinds of ferns. There are two kinds of asparagus ferns. The big arching frond there is Asparagus retrofactus, and then there's another little asparagus growing up in it, and then the big grayleaf fern over there, which is growing actually right out of the dry wall that supports the terrace up there.
Boy, that silver foliaged fern is really handsome with all the golden foliage that you have here.
Yeah, the gold underneath it actually is Helichrysum petiolatum limelight, which is a spreading plant. It'll grow in sun and it'll be rather bright yellow, but here it's very pale chartreuse in the shade, and I like that, I think, even better than the brighter color in sun.
So it's sort of toned down when you put that chartreuse in the shade.
We mentioned making areas into people places as opposed to just plant places. And this was actually one of those spots where I put the pathway up the side underneath this enormous magnolia tree, which casts a tremendous amount of shade, and it also is shaded by a peach tree that you can see the stump of here. We talked about having to accommodate things that might be in more shade as they develop. This is a case where things suddenly wound up in a lot of sun. I was trying to balance the other side of the garden, which is sunny, with things that would give a feeling of brightness in the shade, and relying on variegated things again, the miscanthus there, the variegated one, a variegated phormium in the pot, and one of my very favorite plants, the yellow-green justicia, brandigiana there, that I think is a fabulous shade plant. It blooms all year for me here in Southern California. But actually, probably pride of place is this hydrangea quercifolia, which is an East Coast native. And it's just a splendid plant for shade, has nice structure, big dramatic foliage, white flowers in the summer, and then it colors really quite beautifully in the fall, which we don't see that much of in Southern California.
I notice you have quite a few trees and shrubs that I know later on in the year will add, indeed, a yellow fall color to the area.
They do, yes. And of course, the magnolia blooms white. This is my white garden, a little bit taken off center by the fact that I have a pink crepe myrtle in the middle of it, but the crepe myrtle was here before the white stuff was. So.
These lilies are fantastic, and a lot of people don't think of lilies in Southern California.
No, and well, this is a Riga lily. It's one particular variety that blooms in a certain amount of shade and does well and repeats in California. And of course, I never get them staked up in time, so they definitely lean toward the light. And then there's the white form of symphytum, which is just plain old comfrey. And the blue form blooms as well in shade. Again, a larger form of that corydalus, the sort of bluish-green leaves and yellow flowers. One of my favorite shrubs, Pittosporum crassifolium compactum, which does quite nicely in shade and makes just a wonderful symmetrical plant. But mostly it's the pale colors and the variegated foliage that make this part of the garden interesting. And in the ground covers as well. I've got Rubus calcinoides, which is a good ground cover in shade, but there's also that silvery ajuga. And up here, a plant that in a wetter climate might actually be a menace. This is Agapodium fotograria, the bishop's weed, which doesn't spread nearly as badly here as it would in a place where it rained all of the time. And then variegated ivies, then white campanulas. The other nice things about shady places is sometimes you can get really grandiose foliage, which makes a good backdrop to things and keeps things exciting.
What a wonderful leaf. It's fuzzy, too.
Yeah, this is Peltophyllum peltatum, and which says fuzzy, and has big, bright yellow daisy flowers early in the year.
Once again, keeping with the yellow and gold theme.
Yeah. Well, John, I said that I thought shady places were essential for people, and that was, again, one of the things I learned here. And I suppose it's my secret weapon in gardening in the shade that I put the patio where the shadiest spot was. Makes it more comfortable for everybody who comes here. This is our dining room here on this terrace because the house is small, and it gives us the view. And I still have plenty of room to grow interesting things around here. I have little variegated things here and there, and I have the pond. This is the smaller one, but it, again, is a little focal point of coolness and water in the middle of a shady place in a warm climate garden. And it's surrounded by some of the things that do well here. The golden bamboo, actually some bromeliads, tropical plants just growing outside. And with some of the things that will grow in ponds in shade, the duckweed, which you might not think of as a great plant in a sunny spot, but it certainly looks good in a shady one.
God, it sets those faces off quite well. Well, Chris, thanks for having us. We really enjoyed ourselves.
I enjoyed myself too, thanks.
Oh, good. And we learned a lot about gardening in the shade. Well, this is what gardening in the shade is all about. Gardening in the shade doesn't have to be difficult if you just remember a few simple things. Choose your plants carefully and consider the best use for the space, whether it's for plants or for people. I'm John Greenlee for The New Garden. We'll see you next week.
For your own videocassette copy of today's program, or any one of the 64 other programs in the New Garden Natural Gardening series, Call 1-800-238-6666. Each video cassette is $24.95, including postage and handling. Visa and MasterCards are accepted. Check or money orders may be mailed to the address on the screen. You can also discover sources for plant material, seeds, and innovative gardening techniques by subscribing to the New Garden Journal. Find out more about the methods seen on this program and read articles written by the people you've seen here by subscribing to the New Garden Journal. The journal is just $20.50 for a year's subscription. Simply call 1-800-238-6666. Follow the latest developments in sustainable gardening by calling for this valuable publication. For videos and for the New Garden Journal, that's 1-800-238-6666. Orders only on this line.
Coming up, for all you green thumb enthusiasts, dig into Victory Garden for a fresh perspective on how-to growing and gardening. Next.
We've got to get out of here.